junk bond defaults are starting to surge again. What do we need to be looking out for?
Yeah, I think you need to be looking for, coverage metrics or interest coverage metrics when you're looking at companies. You need to be forward looking instead of backwards looking for many of these metrics. I think you also need to be steering away from some of the shakier parts of the economy. The consumer's been holding up relatively well. We've seen some beneficiaries from government spending, whether that be infrastructure plays or that be some of the AI plays. But there are certain sectors of the economy that have struggled, mainly retail. That it's more of a consumer preference versus a consumer requirement. Even some of the consumer requirements are struggling. If you look at some of the dollar stores, whether that be Dollar Tree or Dollar General, they're having a hard time because the SNAP program was reduced significantly midway through last year. So there's a lot of puts and takes in the economy right now. You need to be careful that you're not getting exposure to areas of the economy that the government's pulling cash away from, and focus on the areas where the government's pumping cash in, because it's becoming more and more apparent that the government is dictating winners and losers in the current economic environment.
Does it ever make sense to have a junk bond allocation in your portfolio if you're a long-term investor?
I think if you're a long-term investor and you were to invest in a handful or even a couple of handfuls of junk bonds, you're going to do well over time. That being said, you might have one or two losers in the mix. You need to make sure that the bonds that you own, as we said before, have decent interest coverage, but also have good asset coverage. So to the extent they're asset-based loans, you want to make sure that if they do go into default, you'll at least be able to recover some of your money if the assets need to be liquidated to pay off the debt.
But I mean, I would just add to that you remember when interest rates first went up, right? And we talked about how a lot of the larger cap investment grade companies were smart enough to term out a lot of their debt before the interest rates really spiked. So there was no near term either refinancing issues or increases in interest expense that could, really shock the system. But now some time has passed, and I can't help but wonder if junk bond defaults are surging, and those are companies where it's a little harder to get financing. They're not investment grade, obviously. They're junk. So you wonder, could this be the canary in the coal mine that says that these high interest rates are finally actually having an impact? And is this one of those the first or early sign that the economy might turn over in the next 6 to 9 months? Maybe, but I think it's definitely something to watch.
Yeah, Adam's referencing, one of the other things that I didn't mention, which is just pay attention to maturities, right? So if you have a junk bond that is, paying something like 5% because it was issued in a 0% interest era, if it gets refinanced at 10%, and the company doesn't have significant cash flows to pay for that additional debt, there's likely going to be a credit event. It might not be a positive credit event as a holder. That being said, a lot of these situations will be worked through. It sounds like the banks are already starting to work with some issuers to make sure that there aren't any kind of hiccups in the system. I think people have been talking about the maturity wall and junk bonds for the last decade, and it keeps getting pushed out another year, another year, another year. So I'm hesitant to say, hey, there's this massive maturity wall, but it is something that investors should have in the back of their mind that it could become an issue to the extent there's a number of these maturities piling up that can't be restructured.